This is not fiction. This is not a story from a dystopian novel. This happened to real women. In modern Europe, and for far too long, the world stayed silent. They were young, many of them just girls. Some were orphans, others were sent by their own families. Their crime, being too pretty, too flirtatious, or becoming pregnant outside of marriage. Society branded them as fallen. But behind those stone walls, the fall had only just begun. For generations, Irish society was built on strict moral codes, many of them enforced by the Catholic Church. Women were expected to be pure, quiet, and obedient. Those who deviated, whether by choice or circumstance, were seen not just as troubled, but as threats to the moral order. And so, they were hidden. The Magdalene Laundries were created as places of so-called rehabilitation, named after Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure wrongfully associated with prostitution. These institutions were meant to cleanse fallen women of their sins. But what they became was something far more sinister. Prisons without trial, labor camps without wages, and homes without love. The first laundry opened in Dublin in 1765. By the mid-20th century, they were scattered across the country, often hidden in plain sight, run by religious orders with deep ties to the state. These facilities operated under a veil of righteousness. They were supposed to save souls. Instead, they broke them. Inside, the girls were stripped of everything: names, clothing, dignity. They were given numbers, forced into silence, and subjected to grueling labor from dawn to dusk, washing linens for hotels, hospitals, even government buildings. They scrubbed and ironed without rest. The profits enriched the institutions. The girls received nothing. There were no school lessons, no letters home, no visitors. Their pasts were erased, their futures stolen. Many had no idea why they were sent there. Some were victims of abuse, only to be punished further. Others had simply aged out of orphanages or were considered burdens by poor families. A flirtation, a rumor, a pregnancy, real or alleged, was often enough to doom a girl to years, sometimes a lifetime, of incarceration. The psychological toll was immense. Women recall being told they were worthless, sinful, unlovable. The constant message: this is your fault. Your suffering is your penance. And society looked the other way. Neighbors heard the cries behind stone walls. Employers sent their laundry to be cleaned. Priests gave sermons about purity. Families moved on, ashamed to speak of the daughters, sisters, and mothers who had disappeared. But those girls, those women, they remembered everything. Every morning began the same way: the clanging of a bell, the rustle of uniforms, the chill of unheated stone walls. The girls would rise before dawn and begin their tasks in silence. Talking was forbidden, eye contact discouraged. Laughter, joy, and even curiosity were signs of defiance. Discipline was strict and often brutal. A missed stitch, a wrinkled sheet, a moment of hesitation, these were enough to earn punishment. Some were locked in isolation rooms, others forced to kneel for hours on hard floors, praying for forgiveness they didn't know. Many suffered in silence, too afraid to speak, too ashamed to fight back. Religion was everywhere. The girls were forced to attend Mass, to confess their sins, to accept guilt for things they had never done. Forgiveness, they were told, had to be earned through obedience and labor. But absolution never came. The more they worked, the more they were punished. It was a cycle designed not to heal, but to control. The worst part, many survivors say, wasn't the labor. It wasn't even the beatings. It was the feeling of being erased, of being told, day after day, that you didn't matter, that you weren't worth love, or freedom, or even a name. And so they endured, hoping, praying, waiting to be remembered. This is where their story begins. The world outside went on. Decades passed, new governments came and went, wars were fought, technologies advanced. But behind the stone walls of the Magdalene Laundries, time stood still. There were no radios, no newspapers. The girls didn't know what day it was or what year. They were frozen in a place designed to erase them, not just from society, but from history itself. For many survivors, memory is fragmented. Some remember only the sound of the laundry machines, the rhythm of their scrubbing, the aching of their hands. Others recall whispers shared between bunk beds late at night, or the cold breath of a nun standing silently behind them. What united them all was the silence, the enforced silence, and the silence that followed them after they left. Because leaving didn't mean freedom. For many, it meant shame. Families often refused to take them back. Communities labeled them as dirty, sinful, or broken. With no education, no money, no support, most had nowhere to go. Some were moved directly into church-run mental institutions or homes for the poor. Others simply disappeared into the margins of society. The trauma lingered. Nightmares, flashbacks, a deep distrust of authority, these became lifelong companions. Many women never told their children or spouses where they had been. Some took the secret to their graves. And through it all, the institutions carried on, backed by the moral authority of the church and shielded by a culture of fear and obedience. The Irish government, deeply intertwined with religious leadership, did little to intervene. Records were lost or destroyed. Survivors who tried to speak out were dismissed, disbelieved, or ignored. But silence can only last so long. In the 1990s, as Irish society began to modernize and globalize, cracks began to form in the carefully constructed facade. Journalists started to ask questions. Activists began collecting stories. Survivors, now older women, found the courage to speak. And then, in 1993, something undeniable happened. Workers excavating the grounds of a former laundry in Dublin made a grim discovery. A mass grave, 155 bodies, buried without names, without records, without dignity. Some were found with broken bones. Others showed signs of malnutrition. There were no death certificates, no explanations, just silence. The nation was stunned. For a moment, the public could no longer look away. The media erupted. Questions were raised in Parliament. The church tried to distance itself. But the truth had risen. Suddenly, the voices that had been ignored for decades began to echo louder. More survivors came forward, sharing their stories. With journalists, historians, and human rights organizations, each testimony was a piece of a puzzle, a picture of institutional cruelty masked as moral care. Some nuns defended the laundries, claiming the women were troubled and needed help. Others admitted they had seen cruelty but claimed they were powerless to stop it. But for survivors, the truth was plain. They had been imprisoned, abused, and forgotten by the very society that claimed to protect them. And now, the world was finally listening. The revelations of 1993 were only the beginning. As investigations deepened, more mass graves were uncovered, more survivor testimonies were recorded, and more dark truths came to light. The Magdalene Laundries were not isolated scandals. They were part of a system that had been protected for decades by church, state, and a society that valued silence over justice. Reports revealed that government officials were aware of the abuses. They had referred women into the laundries, paid for their upkeep, and even used their services. Hospitals, hotels, and even police stations sent their laundry to be washed by unpaid hands. The illusion of separation between church and state began to unravel. Survivors organized. They formed support groups. They launched lawsuits. They wrote books and spoke to the press. For many, it was the first time they had told anyone the truth. But justice was slow. Years passed with little acknowledgement from those in power. Apologies were whispered or buried in press releases. Financial compensation was tangled in bureaucracy. Many survivors felt like they were being re-traumatized, forced to relive their experiences for institutions still reluctant to fully admit their role. And yet, the pressure continued to build. In 2013, 2 decades after the first grave was found, something changed. Ireland's Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, stood before Parliament and delivered a formal state apology. His voice trembled with emotion as he described what had happened as a national shame. For the first time, the government took full responsibility for its part in the decades of cruelty and neglect. The apology was televised. Survivors watched from their homes, from hospitals, from care facilities. Some cried. Some sat in silence. Some had waited their entire lives to be believed. And yet, even with the apology, many questions remained unanswered. Where were the records? Why had the church not opened its archives? Why had no one been held criminally accountable? And why were so many survivors still waiting for basic compensation, counseling, or recognition? Behind the scenes, negotiations were still slow. Religious orders continued to resist full transparency. Some officials insisted that what happened was of its time, an argument that survivors and historians alike rejected. Abuse, they said, is never acceptable. Silence is never justified. Public opinion, however, had shifted. Younger generations began to confront the dark chapters of their country's history. Artists, writers, and filmmakers created works to honor the survivors. Schools began to teach what had once been left out of textbooks, and a new narrative began to emerge, one not of shame, but of resilience. For the women of the Magdalene Laundries, the fight was no longer just about justice, it was about dignity, about rewriting their place in history not as sinners, but as survivors. Their strength, forged in silence, was now being spoken aloud. Today, the buildings that once housed Magdalene Laundries still stand across Ireland. Some have been demolished, others have been converted into apartments, offices, or schools. But for those who lived within their walls, they remain haunted. Monuments, not just of what happened, but of what was allowed to happen. In recent years, plaques have been installed, memorials have been unveiled, ceremonies have been held. Governments and religious orders have made public statements, paid settlements, and offered limited access to archives. These are steps, but many argue they are not enough. For countless survivors, justice has come too late, or not at all. Some passed away waiting for compensation or even acknowledgement. Others still struggle to access health care, counseling, or legal support. And while the stories have now been told, wounds remain open. The Magdalene Laundries are no longer just a dark chapter in Irish history. They are a symbol of what happens when institutions go unchecked, when power is cloaked in righteousness, and when society values control more than compassion. Their story has inspired documentaries, films, novels, and art installations. But, most importantly, it has sparked global conversations about institutional abuse in churches, orphanages, schools, and beyond. From Canada's residential schools to the U.S. reformatories and Australia's stolen generations, echoes of the Magdalene Laundries can be found around the world. What unites all these histories is silence and the courage it takes to break it. Today, many survivors have found their voices. They speak not just for themselves, but for those who never could. They speak in memory of lost sisters, lost childhoods, and lost futures. They speak to remind us that justice is not a destination, it's a responsibility, and that remembering is not enough. We must listen, we must learn, and we must never allow this to happen again. To those who suffered, we see you, we believe you, and we will not forget you. This is the legacy of the Magdalene Laundries, not just one of suffering, but of resilience, truth, and the unstoppable power of a voice that refuses to stay silent. This is the end of the story, but only the beginning of what we do with it.